There is coffee and water in the back if you're willing to make a little donation to Mayday Books here. Thanks to Mayday and Craig for hosting us tonight as well. Since there are a lot of new faces in the room, I'll introduce myself. I'm going to facilitate the meeting tonight. My name is Ginger, and I'm a member of Socialist Alternative and an organizer with 15 Now. Socialist Alternative is a national organization fighting in our communities and workplaces and campuses against the exploitation and injustices that people face every day. We have a long history and in campaigns and struggles against police racism and the fight for women's rights. We fight against budget cuts in public services. We fight against attacks on immigrants, and we fight tuition hikes and war. Recently, we played a leading role in the Million Student March, where students on over 115 campuses nationwide walked out in support of a $15 minimum wage for free college education and against mounting student debt. But we're most well known at the moment for our recent successes in Seattle, where we just re-elected Councilmember Shama Sawant on a campaign for affordable housing and a millionaire's tax. She's the first open socialist to be elected in that level of position in over 100 years. And last year, Shama and Socialist Alternative led the successful campaign in Seattle for the $15 minimum wage, where, we're also bringing that to Minneapolis now, where we're playing a leading role in the $15 minimum wage with 15 Now. We've also done work against foreclosures in communities in Minneapolis and against military recruiters in local high schools. So maybe to say a few things about the meeting tonight. Again, welcome. We're going to structure this in a way that allows, I think, everyone to participate and play a role in being able to discuss the topics that are probably why you came tonight, and also be able to hear from our guest speaker, Algier Hawkins. Mel Reeves, a longtime Northside activist, is going to introduce him, and then we'll open, we'll hear from Algier for about 20-25 minutes, and then open it up for some deeper political discussion for the whole room. The second part of the meeting is going to be about what do we do next and how do we get active in the campaign. We'll hear from a couple of other local activists, including some folks from Black Lives Matter. And then at the end of the meeting, Algier is going to sum us up. And since we're a democratic organization, we'd like to structure the discussion in a way that makes sure we hear from everyone. So in that political discussion portion, I'm going to prioritize folks that haven't spoken. So like one-time contributions, and if people want to come in again, we'll leave that to the end. But I can re-explain that when we get to that part of the political discussion. So yeah, just to get things started, I'd like to have Mel come up and introduce Algier.
Before I introduce, and by the way, she said I'm Mel Reeves. I wouldn't introduce myself as a Northside community activist, but it's all good. If anybody knows me, knows that I've been active against just about every wrong that these people have put upon us. So the Northside is good for right now, so I can claim, Northside is my space. But I do a little more than the Northside thing, but it's all good. So the question is, y'all have come today because we want to answer the question: what will it take to win the struggle against police brutality, police violence? And let me say locally, what it will take is a broader movement, okay? Us activists won't be able to win the struggle, right? Just a handful of folks, we won't be able to win it. We'll win it is if we can broaden this thing out. I was in Ferguson when Mike Brown got killed, not much longer after Mike Brown got killed. And I'll never forget, that's right, you were there with me, and Chris was there with me. And remember that Saturday, we were sitting in the McDonald's on Florissant Street. And as we were sitting there with all these young people, crowds of young people along the street, the NAACP came along with about a 500 strong march. And I said to Chris, I said, well, we're not going to win this fight because there was no united front. You see, there was NAACP was doing this, the young people were doing stuff at night, other people, and there was no united front. And so you absolutely have to build, you don't have to agree on everything. Everybody can do whatever tactic they want, but ultimately you have to agree on one goal. In this case, it has to be prosecution of the police. And so what it will take nationally, of course, is a broad movement. And in fact, I think Tyne will pass out a pretty good sheet that kind of hits at that. It's going to take a broad movement, okay? A broad movement of folks who've had enough of all the ills of this system, right? It's going to take a movement that displaces this system and creates one that's accountable to us, the citizens. In introducing Algier Hawkins, I gotta tell you, I met him, first time I met him was in Seattle at a 15 Now conference. And the brother, I think I can bring it a little bit. I think I can speak a little bit. But I was talking to somebody, and I heard this voice, and I heard this cat, and he was thrown down. He had me spellbound. I was like, who is that dude, man? I got to go up and talk to this guy. I got to meet this guy. So that was my first time I'd actually heard of him, because actually I've read some things he had written and seen him speak on YouTube somewhere, I think overseas. In fact, he's on the National Committee of Socialist Alternative, and he's been on that committee 1996. And he's toured internationally. He's been invited to address audiences from South Africa to Ireland to Brazil to Belgium, and talked about the Black struggle and socialism in the United States. And he is a socialist, and he is, like I am, a revolutionary. And what you need to know is, in short, he's a bad man. And what you need to know about, here's how you know somebody's a real human being. I see him on Facebook with his kids. He takes care of his kids. I watch how he deals with his comrades. He's always respectful. He's always humble. And you can tell he does what he does out of love. I bring you Brother LJ.
Brother Mel made me blush a little bit. That's very kind. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Before we begin, I want to open up with a few quotes. One from Frantz Fanon, who wrote Wretched of the Earth, a Martinique revolutionary who participated in the Algerian Revolution from 1956 to 1962 that defeated French imperialism. He said once that we revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. And Malcolm said, you can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he or she has their freedom. And the revolutionary singer Nina Simone eloquently said, true freedom means not to live in fear. Sisters and brothers, friends and comrades and enemies that may be in the room. I am really humbled to be here with you to discuss the ways and the means to which we can end the crisis that plagues the working class and the poor, but particularly people of color, and I'm thinking specifically Black and brown people. We are waiting as the world awaits the decision of the grand jury in Cleveland, Ohio, the case of Tamir Rice, the case of the 6 police officers who killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Their trial begins tomorrow. We've seen the death of Laquan McDonald in Chicago. And of course, right here in your own city, Jamar Clark assassinated in front of the multitude of people. We're talking about police terror. Over the last 2 days, I've had the honor to speak to and discuss with friends and family of Jamar, to reflect on his life and in many respects to humanize him, as the corporate media, law enforcement, and the ruling establishment of Minneapolis attempts to demonize this brother. So tonight, I just want to highlight the very causes of the state violence. Where does it flow from? How can we address it? And ultimately, how can we end the daily misery and acts of violence by capitalism and by law enforcement? I think it's apropos to begin with this idea that it's not faulty men that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the concept, in my mind, of a faulty system. Wow. The system of global capitalism, and particularly that of the American project, that has been rooted in the daily exploitation, the forced labor of enslaved Africans who arrived on these shores in 1619. I'm thinking of the cheap labor that was used in order to build the edifice of American capitalism and so-called democracy.
All right, tell the truth.
I'm talking about the divide and conquer of the ruling elite that use indentured servants, many of them Europeans, the extermination of the indigenous population. I'm talking about chattel slavery from 1640 to 1865. I'm talking about that wage slavery where you have to sell your labor to the highest bidder in order to sustain yourself, in order for your family to have a future. I'm talking about the Reconstruction period after slavery, where the question of Jim Crow was meant to put Black people back in their place and back into virtual slavery. I'm talking about the labor competition between white workers and Black workers. I'm talking about that competition between the native born in the United States and that immigrant worker. And that at every step, the ruling elite profited off of that concept of race, profited off the concept of slave labor or indentured servitude. It is that construction, that very concept of race, of religion, ethnicity, sex, and gender that has been constructed to maintain the power and the dominance in the society to accumulate the wealth for a handful of people, mainly white men, many of an Anglo-Saxon background, those who owned land. In fact, those that control the wealth and the resources in the society ultimately controls the ideas in that society. In all of its institutions, from the church to education to the media, they reflect the values, the morals, and the ideas of the dominant class in that society. So when we talk about capitalism, we are talking about the domination of the 0.1%. And I will come back to that later. And when we think of so many Black and brown bodies we've lost, sisters and brothers and little children, when we think of Rico Lloyd or Trayvon Martin or Sandra Bland, Jamar Rice, Clark, Michael Brown, trans women, sisters and brothers, how this corporate media takes the victim and make them the predator and makes the predator the victim. In many ways, the violence that we are seeing flows out of capitalism's everyday violence and exploitation. Malcolm X said that they cripple the bird's wing and then condemn it for not flying as fast as they. The state violence that we've seen, the violence of capitalism, the violence of neoliberalism for the past 40, 50 years has been one of the most grotesque features of human society. Let me break it down a little bit for you. 7.1 million children in this nation, the richest nation in human history, live in deep poverty. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. In fact, the Sentencing Project Calculations Institute highlights, since we are in the Midwest and Middle America, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, and Missouri, Ohio, and Wisconsin has the highest or higher ratio of Black to white incarceration than Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Malcolm X said one time, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're south. In Illinois, in fact, it's very interesting. 15% of the Black population lives in Illinois, but they occupy 58% of the prisoners. We're looking at another figure. We have more black and brown bodies in the penitentiaries than we had during slavery in 1850. And that is not even counting the 300,000 immigrants who are held in detention centers in this nation. But we also have economic terrorism. 67% of the new jobs that is created in this country after the fall of the economic collapse of 2007, 2008 has been low-wage retail and service industry jobs, mainly occupied by women, people of color, and the average age of 28 years old with families. At the same time, you have Wall Street, the city to which I was born and raised. Wall Street profited $11.3 billion in profits the first half of this year, while this nation at the same time hoards $2.1 trillion in offshore accounts around the world. Once again, the city that I was born and raised, New York City, has 75 billionaires that live in New York. 60% of the income of working class people goes to housing. 65% of your income goes to pay your housing and rents. In 2013, 50 million Americans live below the poverty line, and 80% live near or below the poverty line. Sisters and brothers, that is economic terrorism. Pure and simple. What is then the role of the police? What is the role of the institution to protect and serve? First and foremost, we must remind ourselves, where does the police derive from? They derive from the slave patrols during slavery. Their role is to catch that disobedient Negro or nigger and bring them back to the plantation and put them in line and show them as an example of what happens when you leave the plantation and you run away or you rebel. The role of the police, in fact, is the role to protect and serve the property, the prestige, and the honor of the ruling elite. That's their first mission. And you can see that, in fact, why there has not been one CEO who should be responsible for the economic collapse of 07-08, not one CEO ever indicted and convicted for their crimes during the foreclosure crisis that took root right here in Minneapolis. We're not talking about Bernie Madoff. The only reason why Bernie Madoff is in jail is because he stole from them to enrich himself.
Right.
How can we win? How can we win? First and foremost, we're looking at the prospects of a grand jury deciding on the question of indictment. You should know this, that the national average for any killer cop being indicted for killing an unarmed person is 3%. We must say that we want the indictment, not by the grand jury, but in fact by the prosecutor. We also know that the tapes, or the tape itself, is in the hands of the federal government. We also must remind ourselves we can't have too much faith in the FBI and the Justice Department. First and foremost, if we're to engage in this struggle on a daily basis and organize in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our schools on this question of police terror, we must know our enemy and make it clear. We are dealing with a system of capitalism that in fact breeds racism, the sexism, the violence, and environmental destruction in our world. And police terror is the outgrowth of the power within the hands of a tiny elite in the society, not only in this country, but around the world. I want to remind you that what they do in Fallujah, Iraq, and what they do in Gaza and what they do in Kandahar, Afghanistan, is what they do here in the United States. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. In fact, we must continue the encampment in northern Minneapolis. But I think this movement has to go to phase 2. What would it look like? Brother Mel touched on it a little bit. But we need the wider forces of the working class to play a more concrete role. We need the labor movement. And the labor movement has a lot of resources, has a lot of human power, has a lot of money as well. But also it has power to which has no understanding of that power. That in fact they can shut down Minneapolis like that. We also need the civic organizations and the youth organizations to play a vital role in the struggle. We need our churches. And in fact, we are coming upon the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott, December 1st, 1955. And so we know the role that our churches could play as being a citadel of not just prayer, but in fact of protest. Also, we are in the city with the Teamsters and the great Minneapolis trucker strike made this city a union town. And so we know the power of labor, when in fact it has a revolutionary perspective. I'm not just worrying about their contract and their jobs, but see themselves as a social justice revolutionary union that's fighting for the embedment of everybody. We need our unions to play even more greater role. Just in the past 24 hours, the National Association of Nurses came out with a powerful statement in defense of the encampment and BLM movement. But we just don't need words. We need action. We need to come down to the encampment. We need them to, in fact, play a vital role into ensuring the security of the encampment and of the protesters. I'm gonna come back to that one more time. We also have the question of the ATU, and we have different bus drivers. ATU and its national president came out in support of the events in Baltimore. Our union here can play a vital role. Just imagine this. The bus drivers say we will go on strike for one day in solidarity with the encampment and for justice for Jamar. But we also need another thing. We need to establish a coalition where it's with democratic structures, where we can discuss and debate tactics and approach to find and struggle for the justice for Jamar. We need those structures to be elected representatives of the various organizations, from the youth organizations, with the family playing a centralized role in that coalition. We need our unions and our community organizations. And in fact, that body could play the role of calling for days of protests, or even a citywide or even statewide protest, to go down to City Hall, to go to the Capitol and make Governor Dayton and Mayor Hodges uncomfortable and put them on their heels. That if justice is not served, we will have days of protests, day in and day out. But we also must defend our services that have been under attack throughout this state and throughout the country. The questions of education, the question of housing and jobs and healthcare. We also need something else. We need a coalition of labor and community. I would say defense committees. Why do I say that? Because Monday and Tuesday night, we saw the element of white vigilante violence, right-wing, white supremacist elements. In fact, this is not a new question for our movement. This is a long storied history of the very violence, not just from the Ku Klux Klan, but the White Citizens Council in the South, the white chameleons born after the Reconstruction period, 1877. And their role was to terrorize Black folks, to put them in their place. And most of the people that occupied those organizations just weren't just ordinary white folks, but in fact, they were the leading business people. They were police chiefs. They were the grand wizards inside the KKK. So in many respects, we have some of those same forces in the police department. And what we have to say, that the kind of rhetoric that's been fueling this process, the Donald Trumps and the Ben Carsons and the GOP, in fact, it is feeding, in fact, the kind of racist, xenophobic, misogynist ideas in the greater society. While on one side, the Democratic Party just points and says the GOP is just crazy, while at the same time, they do nothing to solve these issues. You saw what happened with Planned Parenthood and the shooting. But what is interesting, that the man that committed that crime was able to walk out unscathed, no blood on his body, while as he murdered those innocent brothers and sisters, while he fired upon police. Laquan McDonald, who had a little blade on his side, was shot down 16 times. Jamar had his hands handcuffed as they put a bullet in his head. There's a contradiction in a society that treats one way and another. We must respond. And the best way we can respond is by creating our own organizations that would defend the interests of working people. And that should start with our labor organizations and our community organizations. In many respects, we must reject the two-party system in some respects too. The Democrats must be held accountable. That Mayor Hodges, did she come into office talking about racial equity?
Yeah, yes, she did.
How could she? On her watch, Jamar is gunned down, very much like President Obama. Today, he speaks of mass incarceration only because the social movement of BLM forced them to speak. But in fact, if you look at the numbers, Black folks are in the worst condition under his watch than we were under Bush. We must put these folks on notice and make them accountable for the crimes of this system. We want justice. We don't want a deal. We don't want no money. We want freedom and justice. And that's a greater price than anything they can give us monetarily. Baltimore and Ferguson erupted in 10 months. These are cities that were faced with austerity, major budget cuts. Baltimore has an all-Black leadership and establishment. A Black mayor, a Black city council, a Black police commissioner, a Black establishment, in fact, and still Baltimore erupted. And then when you think of Ferguson, where you had literally a process where it would remind you of the old South, a white mayor, a white city council, a white establishment, but still the kind of conditions that in fact put African Americans and the poor into a position of abject poverty and facing unbridled racism. In many ways, it doesn't matter, actually, the color of the skin of the person who is leading the society in many respects, but whose interests do they defend? In fact, at the end of the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, there were about 100 Black elected officials. Today, we have tens of thousands of elected officials around the country, and still, we're faced with the levels of violence in our community. But something is happening. We have seen the uptick of social struggle. In fact, I would even argue a revolutionary fervor that's taken root not only in this country, but around the world. Look at Missouri, the University of Missouri, and look at the role not just of the students, but football players. There's no such thing as a dumb jock. And in many ways, they stood in solidarity. And when they threatened that we would not practice, that we would not play one game, the president and the chancellor said, we resign. That's the power of labor on one side, but they know what the cash cow looks like. You saw the student protests around the country to oppose student debt. Student debt is at $1 trillion, is higher than any personal debt we have seen in recent memory. Over 150 campuses exploded in anger around student debt, fighting on the question of ending tuition hikes and for free education. We've seen the BLM movement. And of course, the struggle for a $15 minimum wage. People are rising up. People are organizing against the forces that promote racism, poverty, war, and environmental destruction in the name of profits. North Minneapolis is now the new center of struggle that deserves our fullest attention, that deserves our full care and love, that deserves our voices and our bodies at the encampment. Taking this message to every corner of Minneapolis, taking it through every corner of the state itself. I want to end where I began. Malcolm X at the founding rally of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, June 28th, 1964, said these words: "Our community must reinforce its moral responsibility to rid itself of the effects of years of exploitation, neglect, and apathy, and wage an unrelenting struggle against police brutality. We declare our right on this earth to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary." And SA firmly believes we need a system change. Capitalism and racism is a malignant cancer that eats away at the body and mind and soul of working people and the poor. The struggle for democratic socialism and the true democracy of the 99% is on the agenda to finally uproot the seeds and dismantle the edifice, hand by hand and brick by brick and wall by wall, that capitalism and its system of racial and sexual and gender oppression must be torn down asunder, and a new man and woman is born to live in justice and freedom, to live not in fear, but in great hope.